This is a session on how to debrief the executive FiRE index. Yeah, we'll be doing 2 debriefs, and let's start right here with the first debrief. Let me open the report. Okay, maybe I enlarge this a little bit so that you can see it better. Or maybe not. Oh, there you go. Okay, good. So the executive FiRE index has a certain structure that fits like a typical executive presentation, in the sense that there's a bit of an intro that most people don't read. And then there is a summary of a structure, which is the different parts that we have. So we have the executive summary, we have the spheres of resilience, we have the resilience continuum, the mental traps. Then there is a reflection part, which is static. There's simply a collection of questions. And then there is the practitioner summary. And I would like to point your attention to the practitioner summary, because this is where you find everything you need. And it's really easy, it's really quick, and it's really easy to connect the dots here. So we skip all the parts A to E, and we jump right away to part F. So I'm just scrolling down real quick. Part F is a summary of all the key constructs. So part E is where all the reflection questions are, and then we come to part F. Part F is only directed to you guys. Ideally, a normal client, wouldn't go through it because they can't make sense of all the graphics in here. But let me do the logic here and see how we can connect the dots and what would be good questions to ask. So first of all, what we see here is the executive summary. We see on the vertical axis the traits. So everything that is related to resilience that is innate to the personality of a client. And that would mean it's 50% genetic, it's 50% designed or defined in the imprint phase, first 7-8 years of a person's life. That is what the traits define, right? And on the horizontal axis, we have the coping strategies, which are the learned habits that a person has integrated into their life. And in the green bubble, let's remind us, this is where we see the state, the level of actual life satisfaction. So please be aware, we have 3 time dimensions: traits, long time, habits, midterm, and state, short term, long, middle, short. What we see here is 43. 43 is in the area of medium low. So we have a client here, which has a trait-based resilience in the medium low segment. What we also see is that there is a coping strategies in the level of medium high, and life satisfaction is 63. So all in all, what we can see is 43 is on a trait basis a rather low value if you take into account that this is a top level executive with a lot of responsibility, with a lot of difficulties, challenges coming your way. So good questions could be, so 43, tell me about your personality. Tell me about how you react to unforeseen challenges. How do you react to being criticized? How do you react when things go wrong that you didn't see coming? What are typical reaction patterns? And, let them start talking about themselves. What is it that you have learned to do for yourself? What are kind of regular activities that you are doing to cope, to feel better, to re-energize? Those are questions that you can ask in order to kind of work out the coping strategies, right? So the consciously and unconsciously developed strategies that people do in order to feel better. And then 63 is like, so when you, at the time you did the questionnaire, how did you feel? What was like an overall feeling? What was the overall situation like, to kind of get them talking? Because all in all, this is a pretty grim picture, right? So we have somebody that is rather sensitive, is not really doing very much for him or herself. Plus the life satisfaction, let's recall, it's a 100-point scale, is 63. So you do all the work, you have all the effort, and then you're really not great. So is that really a good bargain? Probably not. So that's kind of the first starting point, right? So we see sensitivity or vulnerability, we see there's not much being done on the habits, on the coping strategies, and life satisfaction is not that great overall. Now let's go deeper one level. And deeper one level means, first of all, we go into the traits. And what we see here, you see the color code. Dark red means this is a risk factor. Light red means this is a protective factor. And gray means this is neutral. So what we see here is a need for emotional stability is higher than 50, actually significantly higher than 50, meaning this is a person that is probably easily irritated when he or she gets criticized. They probably either withdraw into themselves, or they get upset, or they are agitative. So it could be different things, but probably there's a lot of this up and down. There's a lot of this emotional roller coaster in this person. What we also see, extroversion is barely 50, meaning it's not a strong extroversion in the sense of that it can really, really help, but it's there. So there is the ability to reach out to others, to talk to others, to open up, to share. And that is probably one strong element in this person. And then there is originality, which means openness for new experiences. To which degree is this person open to new experiences? This is neither super low nor super high, so it also is not a protective factor. So all in all, we see there's one risk factor and one protective factor, which is not very strong. So which adds to the feeling of the vulnerability, of the sensitivity. And again, a question could be, if I was to observe you on a day-to-day basis, how would I see this need for emotional stability kicking in? Or how would I see you, observe you being extroverted? Or what would be a typical reaction pattern if something happens that is unforeseen, that you cannot control? How do you react to that? What would I typically observe? How do you make sense of that? So rather than telling the client what he or she is, really kind of presenting the data, this is how you filled it out, and how do you make sense of it? How explain that to me? So the idea is that you present the framework and have the client explain themselves to you rather than the other way around. That has proven to be way more successful than other situations. And then the maturity of coping strategies, that is the level down from the habits. So every item is codified with you are a habit, and if you are a habit, it's either a self-management habit, so anything related to self-discipline, impulse control, follow-through, sustainability, grit, that all is self-management, or it is a habit that is related to self-awareness, meaning reflection, intuition, listening to your inner voice, or feeling your gut feel, feeling that felt sense, journaling, that kind of thing, right? That would be self-awareness. And what we see is overall 60, a bit higher than 60. This is not a great level of skill or strategies. Typically what we see in leaders that are consciously working on themselves, we see values higher than 70. And by the way, if you ask yourself what would be trait values, so you typically see trait values higher than 50 or even higher than 60 or 70, that is kind of typical. So in the medium high range, kind of. So this is on the self-management and self-awareness axis. Why don't you reflect right now? What kind of questions would I have? Note them in the chat while I let in the dog who is barking in the background. Be back in a second.
So did he just ask what questions we have or what the client might have? What we have?
What we would ask the client to encourage them to talk.
Ah.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, we were just discussing what was the question.
The question was, you have now time to write your questions in the chat because I'm probably talking too fast and that was a time to breathe. Now I'm back, so let's continue. So we have this here, again, the traits, the habits. We have the drill down on the traits. We see what the source of the sensitivity is. in terms of self-management and self-awareness, we see the values are not overly high. What we see is there's more self-management than self-awareness. So in other terms, that gives us a clue that if push comes to shove, that person would tend more towards toughness than towards ambivalence. And I will explain you a little later why that is. Whenever self-management is higher, we have a good idea that probably on a bad day, that person would revert to toughness. And when we see self-awareness being higher, we see that there's, on a bad day, probably the preference sliding towards ambivalence, right? But let me remind you of that a little later when I connect the dots here. All of that we see already on the first page, right? So let's continue. And again, the question is, how would I observe that self-management being stronger than self-awareness? What would I see you do? Can you make sense for me, you know, in terms of that? So let them explain, let they do the work and connect the dots for you, and then you can see if it goes in the right direction in terms of interpretation. Then again, coming from the very first slide, we have the drill down on the life satisfaction, and we see, oh, life satisfaction, here, this is where it comes from, right? We have a score of 60 something, and we see with the first glance, okay, profession, there's something wrong, you know, with job, with status, with money, with professional relationships, relationship to the boss. Something is wrong here, right? So what's happening? What's going on? A lot of questions that we can ask in that direction, right? Then there is relationship, which is any relationship outside of work, friends, family, significant others, all of that would be in here. That's pretty strong. Could be a bit better, but pretty strong, pretty solid. Physicality is everything related to health, is everything related to body. How do I feel in my body? So all of that, that's pretty strong. That's an asset, that's an 80. And then we have spirit, which has to do with what's my mood? To which degree do I live my values? To which degree do I live my purpose? Do I get connected to a higher source of, you know, like spirituality or anything like that? And to which degree do I get energy from here, right? So we see there is, it's not balanced. This is not a wheel. That would be very bumpy if that was a wheel. So what's going on in your job work? Tell me about your relationships at work. Tell me about the relationship to your boss. What's going on there, right? So that could be good questions to kind of dig in deeper. And with that, we have the overall architecture of the resilience of a person, trait, habit, state. Where does it come from? And how does it influence that person, right? And that concludes the executive summary. And now comes the question, okay, I get it. That is me. That's really me. I can see myself in there. How can I get better? And this is chapter B. In chapter B, we see the FiRE model, factors improving resilience effectiveness. And we see every sphere, which is a flame, every flame, and how it relates to a theoretical 100-point score. I've never seen anybody who had 100 point across the board, but you know, there in some areas we see there's more gaps than in others, right? So we see personality. Personality, that's the value that we already know from chapter A, right? So there's a big gap, but as we know, personality cannot be constantly changed. Hence, we can only treat this as FYI. This is good for us to know. What we can work on is anything above, which is the 7 spheres above. All of them are habits, right? Trait, personality, everything else, habit. So what we see is there's many areas where that person can invest time, right? If I've only a limited time, I would look always at what's the biggest gap. And what we see here is kind of interesting. There's the mind-body axis. And do you recall that physicality was something that is very strong for the person right now? And yet the mind-body axis is something that is the weakest overall. And that gives us an understanding of what could be there, because mind-body axis is 4 different things. It's sleep, it's movement, it is mindfulness, and it is nutrition. So these are the 4 things that contribute to the mind-body axis. So it is not the looks that we are seeing here, that's the physicality part or the well-being, but it's probably something to do with mindfulness, sleep, nutrition, and maybe doing sports on a regular basis. That could be here in the mind-body axis. So that would be, if I would be doing it, that would be something that I would look into more deeply. And then you can go into the detail page for every one of them, and you see the breadcrumbs. The breadcrumbs are on each of the detail pages. At the bottom, you remember that bar chart with the risk factors and the protective factors, and the top 3 protective factors and the top 3 risk factors. And the idea is, how can you invest more time into your and energy into your protective factors and less or limit the time, the energy you invest into your risk factors? That's kind of the debriefing approach here, right? So mind-body axis. Next one would be mental agility and biography, right? Mental agility, we remember from the traits that originality was not very strong. Originality, aka openness for new experiences. This is the trait version of mental agility. Here we have the habit version of mental agility, right? So this is how that person could train their capability of deal with unforeseen changes. What can you do there? You can do something new every day. You can learn a new hobby, travel to a new country, speak to people that are totally different than you, do improv theater, do juggling, whatever it is, to train your mental agility, to train that muscle of working with things that are unforeseen. Biography, 60. 60 is a value that typically tells you that someone has not worked with their biography yet. This is somebody who has not worked with a coach or with therapy, has maybe done constellations or any like that. So this is a pretty much raw value. Somebody has not tapped that potential. So maybe now is the time to do that, right? Another question is, so typically what I do is I look at the lowest 2 values, but then I also look at the highest 2 values. Where is this person getting energy from? And that is here, attitude. So this person is a fighter, right? We see 80. What does attitude do? Attitude helps us to get from victim mode to shaper mode. Why is this? Because of a high degree of vulnerability that is based on. So this person is very much fighting himself or herself back to life every day, every time they go through a crisis, every time they get criticized or they get treated in a bad way, they have to fight themselves back to light. And this is, probably something that is very strongly developed in that particular person. Also, very strong energy management. What does energy management do? Remember, mind-body axis was everything that we can do with our body to influence the color of our thinking. Energy management is our capabilities to deal with negative emotions and make sure that we load ourselves up with positive emotions. So how can we influence us with anything else than the body? And what we see here, those 2 are self-management strategies. Energy management means, how do I deal with my negative thoughts when I'm upset? And attitude means, how do I fight myself from victim mode back to shaper mode? So in other terms, that person has a lot of muscle in the degree of getting back into the positive state, right? So the question is, how can we help him or her to maybe develop other muscles, not more of that maybe, but maybe some other things that can help. And obviously, there might also be a reason where you need to change in the outside, because look at profession. I mean, maybe the right thing is to just quit or change roles or whatever and get away from that maybe, dysfunctional or even toxic environment. That's for us to find out in the debriefing, right? So this is the overall scoop. Typically, we don't have time to go through all the 8 spheres. So I would suggest to look at the 2 smallest one, other than traits, other than personality, because that can't be changed. And the 2 highest one to see what can you do more of, and then maybe explore what else would you be interested in. Maybe meaning, maybe authentic relationships could help going forward, right? So that will be my tips on how to do that. And again, how to debrief that in detail. You go to the breadcrumbs on the detail page for meaning, for example, and you look at the protective factors and you say, so how would I see you doing that? How can you do this more often? How can you make sure that you remind yourself of doing that on a regular basis? So that will be the type of questions you can ask in that particular development. And then last one, the last two ones, we see the practitioner summary. And I told you in the beginning, most probably this person is closer to toughness than to ambivalence. And now you can see it. It's not a big difference, but you can see that distance here between the blue bubble and the yellow box is shorter than the distance from the blue bubble to the yellow box of ambivalence. So sorry, I was not making sense. If you go left with the blue bubble, the difference to the delta to toughness is smaller than the delta to ambivalence. That's what I'm meaning. Hence, there is an indication if that person is under stress, under duress, most probably they would revert back to toughness, right? And again, that is for us to ask, to find out. So on a bad day, how would that blue bubble move going forward, right? So that's the how to work with the resilience continuum, and also what's the impact on your leadership behavior? How do your people feel when you slide over to the toughness box? What does that do to them? So also, put that external view on when you kind of go through that. Then we have the last part, which is the mental traps. So the mental traps, remember, we work with this metaphor of Taipei 101, with this huge skyscraper in Taipei, where there's this pendulum mounted in, and whenever an earthquake happens, that pendulum starts to move, and then it sits on these hydraulic cylinders, and they kind of dampen the amplitude. And what you see here is the equivalent of that pendulum in the skyscraper. What you can see here is when something happens, what's happening to that person? You see distorted reasoning. Distorted reasoning means there are emotions coming into my executive function, and I might do decisions that I regret later, like impulse decisions, like firing somebody on a Friday because he really annoyed me, and then spending 6 months in court because that was unlawful. That will be something where that is a risk, right? What we also see is denying a responsibility 60, which means that this person oftentimes is in the victim mode, right? 60, denying responsibility, means it's not my fault. It's my boss's fault. It's this client's fault. It's my employee's fault. It is the system, whatever. It's not me. So that's a not very powerful situation to be in, which is victim mode. And that makes sense because we've seen the need for emotional stability being very high. So that it is very easy for that person to get irritated. What we also see is in terms of unprocessed memories, there's not that much, right? There's no big trauma, maybe buried in their past, at least not that the person is aware of it. So this mental trap is in the direction of, are there elements in my biography that create hot feelings inside of me, right? Hot feelings in the sense of anger, being ashamed, being upset, right? That kind of thing. And then lastly, there is circular thinking, and we see this person is a pro in circular thinking, 80 out of 100, right? So that is meaning mental rumination, thinking in circles, being unproductive, having the same thought over and over and over again, costing you potentially sleep. And that, we might ask the question, are you losing sleep over this? And that would then be connected to the mind-body axis. Body, there is the sleep element in it, right? So how is that kind of connected there? And again, the question is, explain to me, how do you do this? What would I observe you do? How do you make sense of that rather than telling the person, this is who you are? And with this is really it, right? This is the end. With this, you can, within a very, very short period of time, get a full understanding of how the dots are connected, and and then kind of use this hypothesis, but be ready to let them go any minute when you are in the conversation with the client, right? It's not that you are right and you need to convince them. Let's co-create. Let's find out together. You are the one that understands the coordinate system. but the map is for them to explain to you, if that makes sense. So that would be kind of the role split. And now I break for questions. So, okay, there is a question in the chat. You said that on self-management, 60 is not so great. What question would you ask to the client? So, self-management, you could normalize saying something like, typically what we see leaders in your position do is that they have values that are in the higher, medium high, or even high range. How do you make sense of your value? What do you, if you compare yourself to other leaders, what do they do differently than you? Something like that, right? So just help them talk through that, right? Physicality and spirit is high, but mind-body axis is low. How does that fit? Yeah, I think I made that connection, right? So yeah. I talked about that. And yes, what other questions you have? I see a couple of hands. Caroline or Ash, I'm not sure who's first. No, I see Anya's first.
I don't mind which order. So I just stumbled a bit because you earlier said this guy or lady or whoever it was has a muscle in moving from victim to shaper mode. And then we see in this last picture you just showed the pretty like medium to low value. Can you show that again, please?
Sure. Which one are you referring to?
Yeah, denying responsibility.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, and my what I thought was like, oh, if he has a point there in denying responsibility, but he's also somebody who can move himself from victim to shaper.
Yeah.
That might be a solution, or
yeah.
or a workaround.
Sounds like a contradiction.
Yeah.
And the explanation, first of all, great question. The explanation is time. So remember, trade, long-term, habits, midterm, stage, short-term. So these, the mental traps, they are connected to the trades.
Under pressure.
Yeah, okay. That means under pressure, yeah, sure. I'm going into victim mode. I'm going into this, oh no, it's not me, it's them, it's their fault. And then, maybe it takes hours or days or nights to work through, but eventually he or she pulls, let's say it's he, right? John pulls himself up and is back into the light. But there's this valley of despair that he's going through.
So whenever he becomes aware of the situation, or whenever things slow down or whatever.
Exactly, right? Then maybe it's time, maybe he does something else, but he has, and that would be, for us to find out, how do you get through this, right? There must be a lot of pendulum swinging. How do you do this? I mean, this is an art. To be an executive on that level with that degree of traits, that is an art. How do you do that, right? Have that curiosity. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah. Right.
Okay, other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I can't see any hands up anymore, please.
Ash has her hand up.
Okay.
Had her hand up, not anymore.
Hi, I was just thinking, if a client filled this in and the results were like this and they said, look, I was just going through a really bad patch, what's the best response to say? Because it could be denying responsibility. It could be because they're in a sort of amygdala reaction to this report. They're quite shocked. Because when you first look at your report, the results don't look bad until you hear that 60 for someone at your level isn't great. You should be in the sort of 70s, 80s. So that was my first question. I'll stop there and then I have another one.
Sure. So typical way to do this is to say, you know what? Yes, okay, you were in a bad patch. I get that. So where would you draw that dot for yourself? And if you were doing it now, where do you think that dot would land? And then typically what happens is that they put the dot like 5 millimeters somewhere else, and you just go with that. And then what I had oftentimes is that at the end of the report, they go, you know what, the dot was right where it was in the first place. But they're rather, rather than going against the resistance, go with it and say, yeah, sure, where would you put it, right? What would you see differently? What would be your working assumption? And then see if that really holds water once you go through connecting all the dots.
Would it not be, though, that if it's not just about the dots being somewhere else, because how they answer the whole questionnaire will affect every single score. So, it's not just the dot. They might say, I just think everything here, I can see things, but it's just 10, 15% exaggerated. Is there any point in saying, would you like to do it again?
Well, I mean, if they pay for it, they would use their point B code for that. That would be a pity. Typically, you can get this even if you say this is maybe a little bit inflated.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other question I would ask back is, so that was something to assess yourself, and you answered it the way you answered it. Why are you not trusting yourself, right? I mean, unless they intentionally try to skew it, which is why we don't use it in recruiting processes or anything like that. I would say, you know what? Let's see what we can get out of that, and probably the general theme and the answers are the same, and we can see in point B in a couple of months how you have changed, right? Or if you will change. So I would try to not make them spoil their second code, because they could really see great improvement over the 6 months.
And that was going to be my question. I just couldn't remember what the ideal time span is between A and B. Is it 6 months?
6 months, yes. And there will be, this is a function that we're currently working on. There will be there is a default. If you don't do anything, after 6 months, there will be an automatic reminder sent to the client and to you. Hey, so just so you still have that point B available. Here's the link in case you want to do it now. And you can as a coach, as a certified practitioner, you can say, I want that after 6 months, 7 months. You can actually give it a date when it's to be sent out. But if you don't do anything, it's sent out after 6 months.
This is a logistical question. Who do we come to for prices and all the mechanics?
It's all in the presentation.
And don't worry, I'll have a look. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, but if not, just come to Uwe or myself.
No worries. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Would you like to see another one? We just do the same thing. The approach to questions are the same. We just connect the dots for a different report. And let me pull that up.
Karsten, there's another question in chat.
Please, thank you. Okay. And the question being benchmarks. So right now we don't have benchmarks. We will not publicize benchmarks, but what you can generally assume that if you think of an executive, they typically are in the medium high to high segment, both on traits and on habits, and also on life satisfaction. That is something that I would say is desirable, right? If you have somebody on the medium low to low segments on trait, you can ask yourself the question, how much do you want to be an executive? How much suffering is that, right? Or have you created an environment for yourself where this is fine for you, right? So we typically see values medium high to high, and we will have more, we probably will have benchmarks on management level, because what we see in our research is that resilience and management level correlate. So we will probably put out benchmarks for the practitioners, not to go into the report, but for the practitioners on management level, just to be more accurate and not have an average. Okay. So let's have another John Doe. So we have multiple John Does. So same, I'll make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So what do we have here? So same logic. Now we see, this is interesting, right? Now we see traits 78, they are in the high segment. Wow. Okay, so we know already there's a low need for emotional stability. There must be high degree of extroversion. There must be high openness for change, right? So otherwise you don't get to these values. They are in the high segment. Not very often that happens, right? What we also see, coping strategies 61, even lower than the other one. So this is a person that very much considers or hopes that whatever he or she has, let's say it's he, John, whatever he has is because of his raw resilience, right? So his raw resilience, this is what he uses to kind of power through. Stiff upper lip, toughness, right? All of that is probably related to that. And what we see here is life satisfaction is 50. Again, an executive. Wow, I mean, you do all the work and then it's just 50? That is not something that, is something that we should be happy with, right? So how can we do something about that? Let's look at where is it coming from. So we see I'm sorry, I should go to the certified practitioner corner here, right? So we see where is this coming from? So first of all, we see 3 out of 3 protective factors. So in terms of raw resilience, this person really knocks it out of the park, right? No need for emotional stability. So you can criticize that person, you can challenge, you can put them on the stage, doesn't get a pulse, right? Very, very strong. Extroversion, 100 out of 100. I obviously use 2 very extreme reports here to make some points. So can't get higher than that, at least not on our scale. Originality, which means openness to new experiences, which I didn't plan for, 70 out of 100. Also very, very strong. So in other terms, that person is never irritated, loves to be with others, loves to lead, loves to drive change, and really can embrace the unforeseen, right? So in terms of traits, super strong. But what do we know? Too much raw resilience creates stress on the level of the people that I lead, because I might not have the empathy to feel that they are stressed out, because I'm totally at ease, but they are not, and I might not even sense that, right? So that is the risk when we have so high scores on raw resilience. What we also see is the level of coping strategies is not exactly role model quality, right? So this person is probably applying some level of toughness in order to get through everything, right? So we can see that. And we can see it when we get here, that is actually true. So again here, self-management significantly higher than self-awareness. So that person is probably doing a bad job in reflecting, planning, sitting down, thinking, listening to the inner voice. And when everything happens, is probably putting in extra work, extra hours, just give more into to solve or to power through a difficult situation. So again, from a resilience perspective, very, very strong on the trade side, can't get much stronger. Leadership perspective, question mark. And role model perspective, coping strategies, not very good as a role model, right? So what's about life satisfaction? Different picture. What we see is profession, yeah, well, not as bad as before, but also not great. Relationships, there's also a lot of room for improvement. Physicality, and that has nothing to do how the person looks to you, right? I know this person looks super, super, super healthy, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be very unhappy with their physicality. And we have spirit, which is not so high either. So here we see a bit more of a balanced picture, but the balance is on a lower level all in all, right? So none of it is really great. None of it is really a source of energy. So everything is kind of gray right now in that life, and that represents the value of the 50, right? Then how to get better? What do we see? Nothing we can do on personality, plus it's already on a super high level. Biography, this is interesting, right? Biography is very, very low. And, maybe there's room for improvement in looking at the life so far, to look back, to sit down, reflect. Energy management, how do I deal with negative emotions? That's a skill that could be improved. Mental agility, I wouldn't invest too much time here simply because that person has a very high trait in the area of originality. So in other terms, they don't need to do improv theater. They will be naturally strong in you know, improvising and dancing in the moment. That's what they thrive on, right? We see attitude also, that's super strong, so or very strong. Somebody who is used to, you know, working and coming from victim mode to shaper mode, even though the traits are high. But anything related to energy management, that would interest me. And also, you know, authentic relationships, meaning could be an area to kind of look at, right? Because there is some significant gap that could be improved potentially, right? But it will be a challenge because of that high drive of the person. The high level of extroversion in this model also correlates with physical drive and social drive and leadership drive. So this is a person that probably has a lot of unrest inside of them. So you will notice when you sit opposite of them that they are very much going like go, 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 go. And sitting still and reflecting, that's a big challenge for them. What else do we see? We see they are still in the resilient domain, in the self-awareness, in the habits side, right? But we see very much closer to toughness than to ambivalence. So again, on a bad day, they would probably slide into the toughness segment. By the way, we will rework this graph to be more. We will talk about that in the practitioner meeting. There will be an update soon. And then we have circular thinking, and what we see is quite interesting. We see distorted reasoning, not much there, right? So that person is calm and collected in the eye of the storm. Denying responsibility, meaning going into victim mode, not a big thing here. What we see here, though, this is a person that never looks back. This is a person that has memories that if you remind himself, or if you go back, that memories bring up hot emotions. So there might be something to look at in the future at one point in time. And if you know as a context that this person grew up in a war zone, you get a clue where that might be coming from. And then we have circular thinking, and that you don't get from the report. This is context that I now share here. And if you have circular thinking, you see circular thinking, that's a little bit going on here, right? So there's a little bit of rumination happening in that particular person. And again, we can ask, how does it feel for you? And so that's the other John Doe, right? That's John Doe number 2. What questions do we have?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You pointed out the authentic relationships, but there were lower measures even. Why would you go there?
Let me reshare.
I mean, I would go there anyways, but you pointed that out. So you see here the biography and the energy management, and then I would go to mind body access, but maybe not to the authentic relationships. In case of, if I would have time, I would do that, but I would choose those 3.
Yeah,
why would you point?
You're right. Mind body access. So typically what I do is I pick 2 of the lower ones and 2 of the ones that are already strong, and see how can you do more of that, and how can you fix the shortcomings, right? So that we have a balanced view and not look only on shortcomings.
Good, thanks.
Other questions?
They're all in chat.
Can somebody help me? I have to switch back and forth otherwise.
Yeah, so Ash is asking, what does a grade report look like? For the continuum grid, ? Have you seen many ?
So the continuum grid, you can have scores that go in the, in the high 70s on both dimensions. And what we typically see, I probably shared with you our research paper on the first real data sample of top managers doing the executive FiRE index. And what we can say is you need a high degree, or what we can say is a high degree of trait resilience, raw resilience, correlates with the likelihood of becoming an executive. What we also see is that a high degree of habits correlates with staying in an executive position. So you need that robustness to be selected, and then you need the habits to survive and thrive in that particular area, right? So what we typically see is if somebody is really top notch, they are probably here in the really upper right corner, and this is what we will also update here because it's too easy to get in the resilient box right now. We will change that a little bit so that there's more of a neutral space in the middle. So higher than in the upper 70s on both dimensions.
Karsten, I have a question as well on the mental traps.
Yes.
If it comes to low denying responsibility, can it also be seen in taking over too much responsibility?
Okay. Let me go through the items real quick. So the items that create this, they say something like, when things go wrong, I complain, or stuff like that. So it's this unproductive, not taking over responsibility, but being in this in this kind of mode. So I wouldn't go the other way, that this says that somebody is taking up too much responsibility, but you can always ask. You can always use the question if you have the intuition that this might be the case. We don't test that. There's no item for that, I think. But what could be I like that question. So let's look at it. We have extraversion, 100 out of 100, which means there's a high degree of all sorts of drives, also the drive to take over responsibility. There's not much, putting responsibility on others. So your intuition is probably right. And connecting the dots, it's fair to ask that question. Yes.
Thank you.
Karsten,
Yes.
I didn't get the second part from your point before. A high degree of raw resilience correlates with becoming an executive. What correlates with staying an executive? That's the one
High degree of habits. High degree of habits.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's this white paper, Secrets of Resilience, Secrets of Resilience in Top Management, that we published this year, which is actually quite interesting. So I recommend to flip through the graphs at least, and see what are kind of the deductions that you can make from the graphs. But what we can say with a bit of certainty is that a trait is a raw resilience, meaning high values in trait correlates with being selected as an executive. But that report here is an executive that needed to change on the resilience domain and has changed. So we see that typically, if you want to survive or even thrive in that thin air, high degree of habits need to be developed, and that's then our job.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question,
and
probably this question is going from the coaching role, but still. So typically, after taking some questionnaire, people just ask, okay, we had the debriefing, yeah, we had the discussion, so what should I do? So are we allowed, to give some advices, right? Where they should work a lot, or what should they do, or recommend something?
Of course, absolutely. So let's this is actually what happens here, right? So assuming we go to energy management and we want to help that person to improve in energy management, let me just close your eyes so that you don't get triggered by the reflections here. Energy management, right? So what we see here we see the breadcrumbs, okay? So risk factors, I'm available 24/7 for others. I have no control over my schedule. Okay, so dear John, what can you do to improve here on that risk factor? What could you do? Could you set boundaries in your calendar? Could you include break time? You have with your assistant? Could you have digital detox times? Could you have off times, right? So that would be that kind of things. Then protective factors. I prepare myself for challenging situations. I know what I want to achieve. I separate important from urgent tasks. So he's doing that already. How can you do more of that? How can you include preparation time into your calendar? How can you make sure that somebody is helping you prepare for challenging situations? How can you spend time maybe to plan the week, to reflect on what you want to achieve? So how can you do more of the protective and less of the risk factor? This is what we call the breadcrumbs, Joanna. And with that, we can always give an advice, but even better, we can point them in a direction and have them find out what would help them there. Make sense? You're welcome.
Yeah, yeah.
And that holds true for all of the 8 spheres, right? So there's always these risk factors, protective factors, and if you follow that lead, you go in the direction of, more protective factors means more resilience, and less risk factors means less vulnerability, right? So that is how that is to be read. Other questions? So easy.
I have a verbal question, maybe. It's allowed? Verbal question?
Yes.
Okay. So far, I thought values of 60 are quite okay. Now I'm learning through your explanation that 60 might be very middle. How can I balance and trim the judgment of these values? Because I feel now that even 80 is, or 70 or 80 is not, it might be just high. It could be even more. So how can I trim my experience a little bit better? I have no data available, just my reports, and these are just a handful.
So we'll be publishing these benchmarks for the practitioners when we do the next data sample. So we are approaching the next 1,000 data sets. Then we will do the next cut, and also then kind of deduct what are on top on different management layers, for example, what are kind of averages that we see, just to give you some pointers. But I mean, it's always a good consulting answer, right? It depends. A values of 60 on the area of habits simply means that you're not doing much, right? You're doing something, but you're not doing much. So when you start to see values of 70 and 75 on the habits, you know that somebody is really putting in the work, right? So you're not just going through your day and doing all, the duty task, and then when some time is left, you take care of yourself. Values of 70 would indicate somebody's putting in the work, or somebody has hit the wall once and they learned from it, right? On the traits, we simply can say that it also depends on how the 60 are composed. Need for emotional stability, extroversion, originality. It's an intuition thing, right? But if you have a high value for need for emotional stability, you already know that this person is being irritated on a regular basis, that being calm, being zen is something that will not happen for that person a lot. If that is like we saw in the first case, right? If you see somebody with a super high value on extroversion, you can see there's a lot of drive in all sorts of dimensions, right? To reaching out, to changing things. So all of that needs to be factored in to judge if it's a high value, which is why we are not publishing benchmarks for the regular readers, for their clients, right? It really needs to be taken in with a lot of common sense. If that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to put that into context. But general, a life satisfaction value of 60, I don't know about you, but that is nothing that I would strive for, right? So in terms of life satisfaction, you work 80 hours, then at least you should be happy, right? At least that. So anything like 75 and higher would be something that I look for, and otherwise I would ask, so how do you feel, right?
And that's the aspect that might be the most temporary.
Say it again. Yes, yes, absolutely. So
Something that could be most temporary.
look at the winter outside, that influences your state. Look at the news, that influences your state. Have a great meal, have a nice weekend with the family, that influences your state, right? So it's going up and down, right?
And it might be quite interesting if, for example, someone had a lower life satisfaction and they weren't as happy as with all their scores, even if they were in and about the right place, and they looked at part B and maybe the traits were higher because of that general malaise that affected the way of answering it. And they might say, look, you know, I actually fixed some stuff in my life. I'm happier, and I was able to sort of answer these with a much, you know, more optimistic and maybe fair lens rather than a subjective kind of down lens.
Absolutely. So that overall color of the thinking when you are answering the instrument, of course, plays a role. Let's make sure that we all understand that, right? Even though we try to minimize the impact on the traits, for example, by, you know, asking the items in a particular way, but obviously there's a color that or a tone of gray that comes into the coloring scheme, and that might change. And this is why we do it twice, right? Remember, you cannot benchmark the EFI to anybody else's benchmark EFI values. You can only benchmark it to your own values. That's the only thing that really makes sense. And then the good thing is when somebody started very dark, I mean, the good news amongst us is that it's very, very easy for them to get better in the point B and then celebrate. Yeah, look at that. Look, your habits went through the roof, and life satisfaction and even traits a little bit. Look at that. How did you do? Right? So, and we're over time, we're approaching the hour. Just want to make sure, did you get what you need? Is there any question unanswered for the time being? Okay, cool. So
Brilliant.
we will make this available as a recording, and we will share that with this group. So it's also not deleted going forward, so you can always go back before a debriefing, so you get everything that you need. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a great
you.
day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Absolutely.